Okay, so good morning, everybody, and thank you all for being here bright and early on a Tuesday morning. My name is Sana Elimia. I am a faculty member here at the Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations, and I will be chairing this lovely panel today, so I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone's work. I will be introducing everybody individually in more depth as the talks go on, but please allow me to introduce the panel and the panelists very briefly. The panel today is on historical perspectives, and to my right we have our first speakers who are second in the order of the actual pamphlet and booklet that we have. Our first panelist is running slightly late, and hopefully we're hoping he should join us as well. So the first panelists that we'll be hearing from today are Claire Savina from St. Anthony's College, Oxford, and Hannah Scott Ducar from New York University. They'll be talking about, their topic is Define Rape, Translation and Correction of Sexual Violence across French, Ottoman and Egyptian Penal Codes. Following on from that, we will hopefully be hearing from Mujib Khan from Tokai University, talking on law and modernity in non-European contexts, contemporary sensibilities in Japan and Islamic law. And then, of course, at the end we have Hanam El-Farhati, who will be talking from the University of Leeds, who will be speaking about a corpus-based analysis of deontic modality and obligation and permission in Arabic English constitutions. And hopefully when Muhammad Ahmed Sawabteh will be joining us from Al-Quds University, he will be speaking about legal pragmatics and politics, the case of translation in the government of Palestine. So allow me briefly to introduce our first two speakers in a bit more detail. We have joining us Claire Savina from the University of Oxford, St. Andrews, and we have, if I can just find my little notes here, and we'll be having who's an independent researcher and translator and author specializing in gender and translation studies. And after completing a curriculum in both comparative literature and Arabic studies at the University of Paris-Sorbonne, she worked as a research associate at Oxford University. She's also been the research project manager of the Kitab project here at the Aga Khan University, and has co-led with Frédéric Lagrange Words of Desire, the Arabic erotica and its translations, and she is now co-leading with Marilyn Booth translation from the Mediterranean to the Arabian Sea in the 19th century. And she has also collaborated on Nikon in Paris about women who have been forgotten or misrepresented in history. And here, of course, we have Hannah Scott Ducar, who is a doctoral candidate at the Middle East and Islamic Studies at New York University and has published an Arabic literary production of the Nahda and has recently won the ACLA Owen Aldridge Prize for an essay on the earliest 20th Arabic translations. And her wider research interests include translation studies, literary and political theory, and the intellectual and cultural history of the Middle East. And her current dissertation focuses on linguistic reform, theories of language, and circulating literatures of crime, surveillance, and law. So thank you so much to be here with us, to all of our panelists. And I will hand over to our first panelists, who will be speaking to us for around about 20 minutes. And then we will have about 10 minutes to engage with questions with them as well. So over to you both.
It's working. Should I put that? Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. Yes, yes. Are we ready?
Well, I thought we were second. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the first person is up. Thank you. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's a beautiful day. I'm sure we're all very glad. Okay, so this paper is just the very beginning of a larger project that we've been thinking about for a while, which, like so many of the other projects brought here, I suspect, is returning to a question that's been somewhat neglected, even rejected in recent decades, which is the place of translation in the functioning of colonial and imperial law. So, for us, the question on the definition of sexual violence and rape, which sat as it arguably did in the late 19th and early 20th century at the intersection of new concepts of public order or interest and private morality or honor. We'll come to those definitions in a bit more detail later on. This question seems to us to be central to understanding the processes by which crime itself emerged as a category both in Europe and differently, but not unrelatedly, in the Ottoman Empire and those provinces which eventually fell into European hands. Now, once you start thinking cross-nationally about law and crime, particularly in imperial and, to borrow Laura Doyle's term, inter-imperial contexts, you come, of course, inevitably to the question of translation, that is, to the ways in which concepts and definitions move across languages and legal systems in ways that are conditioned by the power relations in which those languages are already enmeshed. So particularly in the context of imperialism, a power differential and violation of sovereignty, which has itself been somewhat problematically conceived, as Said and others remind us, as analogous to rape. So this is the sort of problematic that we're working with. The paper then is the start of an attempt to disentangle rape and sexual violence as metaphors used to discuss translation and imperialism from the material ways in which translation and imperial lawmaking serve to remake, in different ways, understandings of rape and sexual violence as criminal acts. So today we'll do this firstly by briefly outlining where the scholarship stands currently on the question of rape and sexual violence in the sort of long 19th century. Then we'll detail some of the historical specificities of the French, Egyptian, and Ottoman legal context in the late 19th and early 20th century, and we'll begin to track a constellation of terms, which we've encountered across a range of sort of legal adjacent, extra-legal texts, on which definitions of rape are turning roughly in the period 1850 to 1940. And the ways in which these different terms interact with one another seem to us to push the question of translation particularly to the fore. We'll end by discussing in a little bit more detail what seems to us the most interesting or maybe disturbing element of the research thus far, which is also the part we're most excited to explore in the future, and that's namely that in both Arabic and Ottoman Turkish, it's seemingly through property laws and emerging capitalist notions about property that a notion of consent rather than honor becomes central to the delineation of rape as a crime and as a legal term. So I will just start by discussing very briefly some of the scholarship produced so far on the topic, in order just to offer a sense of where we see our intervention to be, and then I'll hand over to Claire for the real work. So perhaps the most important intervention into the study of 19th century legal change in Egypt, as I'm sure we already know, we know in the last several years, has been in the field of social history, with, for instance, Khalid Fahmi's various studies of policing, legal and medical practice in Egypt from the 1800s until 1879. So Fahmi briefly has proposed a move away from the intellectual to the social history of law. He argues that our sort of past focus on the production of law as the work of a few intellectuals, or as the sort of circulation and translation of legal concepts at an abstracted level, has obscured the ways in which law actually functions. So how ordinary people confront or are confronted by it, how they mobilize or resist it, and the new forms of corporeal surveillance that changes in lawmaking were making available to the state in the 19th century. Describing the emergence of forensic medicine in the 19th century in Egypt, Fahmi tends to trouble narratives of legal change as based on the adaptation or translation of French and European codes and practices. He argues instead for the indigenous emergence of legal forms, of new and state-establishing legal forms, and of course of corresponding indigenous forms of resistance to them. Now Fahmi, although he's very interested in the question of law and the body as it emerges in the field of forensic medicine, he doesn't address specifically the question of sexual violence and assault. But various scholars, inspired, if you like, by his approach, have taken up the question. So Mario Ruiz, for instance, has a fascinating study of the narrative structures of Egyptian court records from the police departments and juridical councils. And he argues that it's in these records, quite as much as, and indeed rather than in legal codes themselves, that sexual honor and morality and their violation were constructed in this period as new objects of state attention. Liat Kozma, whose emphasis on the discrepancy between what she calls law and practice is certainly indebted to Fahmi's intervention, I think she worked under him, has produced a lengthy essay on the subject also, so a lengthy study on the subject, sorry. So Kozma asks how police and medical examinations became commonplace in Egypt in legal proceedings to the extent that they played a significant part in consolidating state power, and further, of course, had a significant impact on the construction of gendered subjectivities and gender relations. So she traces, for instance, how honor killing emerged as a crime, which is itself a relatively new or redefined term, in the mid-19th century at the intersection of multiple competing power relations. She also, in a chapter devoted to virginity, honor, and premarital declaration, she discusses the ways in which incidents that we would certainly consider rape today, are conceived in this period in terms of the violation of female honor, namely virginity, which in itself is understood less as female bodily integrity than as family property. Cosmo's study is limited to Khedive Egypt, but Hanan Hamad's work on labor and sexuality in what she terms Egypt's industrial period, so the 1940s, takes up a series of individual legal cases of sexual assault, and her findings demonstrate a shift in this later period from the legal sanctioning of violated virginity or honor, which is how sexual assault was largely conceived, people are arguing, in the long 19th century, to the sanctioning more broadly of violence conceived as sexual, which seems like an interesting change, except that she points out that the onus remained on the survivor's body, particularly on women's bodies, to bear the marks of proof of assault, while state capacity to surveil those bodies only increased with the introduction of examinations to prove the marks of violence. Now, all of these authors, as you will notice, avoid using the term rape in general, given its notable absence as a fixed term throughout the period in question, which is something that Claire will discuss. Where these studies tend simply to stop at avoiding anachronistic terms, and so they employ those as their sources, we wanted to focus directly on the terms themselves and to articulate the ways in which these terms in Arabic, Ottoman Turkish, and French, which occur not only in penal codes but also in a range of other legal texts, including court records, articulating the ways in which they kind of shift in and out of vogue and influence one another. So texts we've encountered, for instance, are the many published translations of the Ottoman Penal Code, which was translated almost immediately into Greek, French, English, and various other languages at the time, including with sort of commentaries on it. The bulletins that were put out in Egypt, which were trilingual, the yearly bulletins on the proceedings of the native and mixed courts, newspaper reports, court records themselves for any case involving a party who didn't speak Arabic are frequently effectively translational text, right? Because the court cases took place in multiple languages, although the records are either in English or Arabic. We also found some interesting texts designed to train translators and interpreters in legal vocabulary. So for us, what was interesting here and what made it seem essential to focus on the terms themselves was that, somewhat contrary to the reasons for which translation has been somewhat rejected by social historians as an interesting topic for historical study, it shouldn't, I think, vanish if or when we shift to social history. It's not simply something that happens at the abstracted level of legal codes. On the contrary, it remains urgent at pretty much every level of the legal process, and the many texts we found that were translational, I think, serve to demonstrate that.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just continue there. So as we think most of us know, it was in the 19th century, in the course of the series of reforms, and that's a tricky word that we are willing to discuss, imposed throughout the Ottoman Empire from the 1840s onwards, that the legal system of the empire was transformed, instigating a shift, however gradual and uneven, from a system of Sharia to the institution of codified laws borrowed from the French model, though by necessity incorporating some principle from the Sharia, and how many of it is topic of debate, of course, but that's not what we're going to do today, and adapting to different realities. In fact, and this is what has been relevant for historians of law interested in translation, the Ottoman Penal Code of 1858, which formed the basis for criminal law in the empire throughout the next decades, and was also directly translated into Egyptian later on, was directly based on the French Penal Codes of 1810. But then the Egyptian was translated from the Penal Code of 1832, because basically the Ottoman Turkish translated from the French of 1810, and then the Egyptian was translated from the Ottoman, and the Egyptian was then retranslated directly from the French, which was the 1832 Penal Codes. But we're going to go into this later. Large parts seem to be mere translations of it. In the case of the articles referring to what we would term in English today rape or attempted rape, for instance, not only the punishments accorded for the crime but the very wording and sentence structure of the act's description in the legal text is markedly similar to the French, as are, for instance, the ages in which a child is considered a child, under 11 in 32, and then from 63 it's pushed to 13, and then in 1945 it's pushed to 15. So today, puzzled by the lack of clear definition in the 19th century legal text of what constitutes as rape, we want to make a few points to explore the construction of a discourse around rape, a legal discourse. First, one point that I would like to make from what we've been studying is the use of the word debauche for anything that relates to rape on children until the 1832. And it's the same in Egypt, because we use the word hat-kalail and systematically used for children. Altogether, rape on children does not exist in the long 19th century, and actually in France in the legal text until 1980. It's called debauche, which implies that the victim and the perpetrator are both guilty of something. So that's the first point. The second point is that we want to make here that there's a very interesting shift in the evolution from the 1810 French Penal Code to the other one, which has an impact on what's happening in Egypt at the same time, which is the introduction of atteinte à la pudeur. So if you read the 1810 French Penal Code, the article 331, quiconque aura commis le crime de viol ou sera coupable de tout autre attentat à la consommé ou tenté avec violence contre les individus de l'un ou de l'autre sexe sera puni de réclusion. So here we have attentat à la pudeur with violence. And in the 1832 Penal Code, we have the introduction of attentat à la pudeur without violence. Tout attentat à la pudeur consommé ou tenté sans violence sur la personne d'un enfant de l'un ou de l'autre sexe âgé de moins de 11 ans sera puni de réclusion. And here you can hear age of less than 11 years old as well. So I'm going to translate really quickly. So any attempt to the honor, consumed or attempted to consume without violence on a person who's a child of one or the other sex, age of less than 11 years old, will be punished of reclusion. So what comes here as a new approach to the what's constituted as sexual violence is that before that moment, there's no clear possibility to define what constitutes as rape and consent, and it's with the debate on consent that this comes into the penal code. So what it says here is that a person who's less than 11 years old doesn't have to prove that they expressed their non-consent and there was violence exerted on them, which is new and which appears in the 1832 Penal Code and is in all the debates at the time, whether it's in Egypt or in France. The question of consent is not clearly said and worded in the Penal Code, but it's there in the debates, in the trials that we've read. So that's the shift. That's the shift moment. But indeed, the shifting introduction of notions of consent and atteinte à la pudeur engage a construction of a legal discourse based on translated from property law and public order. So the moment where consent comes into the equation, that's where we're shifting from a discourse on rape merely based on violence to something based on property law and public order, which was also present in the past, but mainly property law. And this is what's interesting to us. And what we find in the Egyptian wording of rape and sexual violence at the time is that we have Hak Elaid until the 1940s,
Yeah, various terms.
Yes, but basically, and zina as well. But I don't think we're going to have time to go into zina today. And from the 1940s, we have irtisab, which is also used in property law for robbery. So that's what was, and in French you have also the same difference between vol domestique and viol domestique. It's also everything that constitutes an extenuating circumstance or an aggravating circumstance can be also related to what we find in property law. We observe that both the lack of a clear definition of what constitutes rape, sexual aggression, absent from the code, because there's no clear definition of what is what, alongside with the individualization of punishment that comes also in the 19th century legal debates. You can find it in Michel Foucault. So basically the extenuation of circumstances, extenuating circumstances, throughout the long 19th century, and the reluctance to punish severely leads to observing other infractions such as violence, to assert consent and non-consent, and to examining the purity, the virginity as a parameter to extenuate, aggravate punishment, both involving the systematic exhibition of the body we are supposed to be protecting. Other like what says Liad Kozma, for example. Other parameters such as age, recidive, incest, domestic rape are ultimately coming to frame more than define the crime that rape or sexual offense constitutes. Rape in the long 19th century is an empty significance, only just signified by those defining parameters. And the last point I would like to make before we wrap up, the focus on the question of the loss of virginity defloration, and often blurred, confused in terms of criminality with question of premarital intercourse, and also the focus on the personality of the woman or the child, because that's what becomes also with the question of consent. The question is, who is this woman? Who is this child? Was he flirting? Was he trying to seduce? Was he playing? Etc., etc. New discourse that was not present before the introduction of the. So it's two sides of one coin, right? Is we introduce the idea of consent. We introduce the idea of sexual assault that is not rape, that is not a penetration of a penis into a vagina, because that's what it is until the 1950s even. But it comes with questioning the credibility of the child and the woman. So lead to the use of zina, which constitutes firstly a contradictory, a blurry notion, and becomes the umbrella for any forbidden intercourse. The entangled relation sexual assault defloration reinforces what Liad Kozma and Hanan Hamad have already diagnosed from other perspectives, how the essentially female body and essentially her genital part and her hymen becomes the arena of the trial and legal debate. Can I finish?
We should be,
yeah. But I mean, we have more time, no? Okay. We are trying to explore and understand how the construction of a legal definition and the establishment of a lexicon originated at the encounter of three fields from which it borrows and translates: violence, honor, virginity, public orders, mirth, and with the apparition of the growing notion of consent, sexual consent, property law, and this across languages. And what we have begun to do in order to conceive and comprehend what actually defines and translates as rape in the long 19th century is to try to start to trace a constellation of terms that were in place across the different texts and the ways in which they shifted in relation to one another and over time. Our abstract focuses on the translation of terms in the penal codes, and we have started to explore beyond these codes, court reports, dictionaries, and lexicons at use in the period, theoretical texts on law and exegesis of penal codes, and to chart the divergence and interrelation of a whole constellation of terms in French, Ottoman Turkish, English, and Arabic, which come up in a range of legal and extra-legal texts. I'm just going to show the image, and then we can.
Yeah. Okay.
And this is the constellation that we're trying to, we've started to do. So some of you in the room know my my little app. So here you have in brown you have the French, and in darker brown you have the English. Like the colors are not really good in this. And so we're trying to explore. The idea is we're confronted to this question, rape, that is not defined in the penal code at all, and we're trying to see how it comes at the encounter of those three fields that we described before: violence, honor, virginity, property law, and public order. And at the same time to do it through different languages. So we have here the French, and here we have the Arabic. How the Arabic, we're going to have the Ottoman Turkish that is starting, and we're going to try to explore how we can constitute a definition that would be ours of what is rape in the 19th century, but not through the word-to-word translation, but through the constellation that should constitute, in my opinion, translation. So that's what we're going to do, and maybe we can discuss it in questions. Thank you for giving me more time.
Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to open up the floor for some questions for our panelists as well. It'll be a little bit shorter than we would have liked, but please do offer us your questions if you do have some. Yeah.
Can I hear a little bit more about the methodology around the app?
Okay. So this is an app that I have developed for my research previously on translation, but I'm not going to go into this. This is an app that has been created by a bit of a genius of a hacker. And do you want to know how it works, or?
Well, I mean, maybe explain what we're seeing and what the relationship is.
Okay. So we're seeing dots that are smaller to bigger according to how many relations they have with the other terms or notions. And in the middle is viol, because I'm French. And then it translates, you have the words into which it translates, the words that of which same family, like when it's the same family. For example, you have rape and rapt. So they're the same family in Latin, but they're not the same used in French and English. I think it's a training. It's every
Tuesday, yeah, every Tuesday usually. So yeah.
And then we have colors for languages. And then we can enter also the smaller nodes. See? So this is how this relates to all of those terms. What we want to do, this is very, very new, and what we want to do is to add, I think maybe you want to say that, but with Hannah we want to add the dates in which those words come into practice and come into use, whether it's in the penal codes or in the press or in the reports or in the debates.
Yeah, we're trying to track across sources also, and maybe also to distinguish, because we found some texts in which there is direct translation happening, so you'll get 2 or 3 words together, and you'll see the Ottoman and the Arabic and the French, and they're being used directly to translate. I would like to distinguish between places that they're directly translating one another and places that we're making the connection. But it should be really interesting to bring both the text, because we're tracking across a range of texts, and it's very much ongoing. We'd like to bring both something about genre of sources and the dates into it, and I think this would be useful across the board for translation. Certainly for my own work, it would be useful to have something like this, but we're still experimenting, really.
Yeah, this is a really new project that we have, and I've used the app that I've been using for a long time to try it with Hannah, and we like it. But we also, I think we could also consider implementing the geography. Where is it used? Because it is sometimes different from the countryside to the city. And it's also in which courts as well, because you have the misdemeanor, but you also have felonies, and they're not treated in the same courts. So yeah, it's also that. Yes. Sorry.
I was hoping you could tell us a bit more about the relation that you see between the official and unofficial translations.
Do you want to answer this? And I can answer after.
Yeah, I feel like that was the sort of place that we wanted to go with this presentation, and then we never really got there because there was so much other stuff to talk about. I mean, I'm not sure that one of the things that's interesting to me about the period is that I'm not sure that the difference is so stark. So, for instance, I've always enjoyed the fact that in Egypt, in the period, there's this I don't know if it's a law, but certainly there's a rule that laws don't effectively come into place until they've been published in the newspapers for at least 30 days in the languages of the people, like in the languages that the people to whom the laws apply can understand. So there's like an acceptance that a sort of unofficial translation that's taking place in the press has some legal bearing, right? Because the laws, because for 30 days at least, like it has to have been translated and put into the press. So that was our sort of starting point. It's like where do official translations start and end? Like what's the difference really between so in my own work, for instance, I've been working a lot on the Dinh Shui trials, which of course take place constantly, and like all of the records that we have are a translation. The originals have been lost, but also the ways in which the laws are applied is in translation. So they're constantly translating between different legal systems. They're like they mistranslate qatl in order to get the right verdict for murder. Like I'm not sure that certainly there is the official translation in the sense of the penal codes. Beyond that, official, non-official seems to me to be not a super useful distinction in the sense that there seems to be this sort of haphazard approach to translation. I think that, yeah, I mean, that's what we've come across, is that things are being retranslated at such a rate that to pinpoint in a sort of official definition.
And Dinh Shui is significantly later.
Dinh Shui is 1907, exactly. We start from 58, and we go right into the mid 20th century. I mean, Dinh Shui is a particular case; it's a special tribunal, so of course it's not the same as everything else. But.
And I think I'm going to support what Hannah said around the fact that is it relevant to distinguish the two, because we're trying to I think what we decided to do while we were going into this project is, okay, we need to understand what it is that is constituting sexual violence, and for that to happen we need to use everything that exists, because there's no definition per se. So there's no official definition, and the idea is to use the and I think this is why we started to use this tool, because it doesn't label what is official and what is non-official. It just comes together to create a meaning. And I think I answer more your question now, Nora, as well. I think that's not our point, maybe.
This is what came across from your abstract, actually. Those are the categories that you were using, so that's why I was wondering why you decided not to elaborate. But you
we started with the penal code, and that was very good point. That's why we changed our abstract. We started with this, and there was so little information in it that we had to expand. And that's what it's been a difficult work as well, that we decided, okay, they say nothing. They inform not a lot. They don't inform a lot, except in the evolution from one to another. So what do we do with this? And then we started to explore court reports, theoretical texts that are analyzing the penal codes, that was much more rich, actually.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm sorry I'm going to have to cut the Q&A just a little bit short. So thank you both very much for sharing your work with us and for the discussion as well. Okay. So we're going to just swap around a little bit with the order. So I'd like to please welcome So I'd like to welcome onto stage and to join us here our first panelist, who's now will be rearranged as the second panelist, of course, Mohammed Ahmed Sawabte from Al-Quds University, who will be speaking about legal pragmatics and politics, the case of translation in the government of Palestine. Would you like to please? Yeah, you can. You're okay. You can start. Yeah, you're welcome to sit, or you're welcome to stand, wherever you're more comfortable. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I will keep the introductions brief, just to manage the time.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm terribly sorry for any inconvenience that I may cause, simply, for some reasons. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon. I'm very happy actually to be among distinguished translation theorists and practitioners and legal experts as well. I will talk about a period of legal translation in Palestine under the British mandate from the 1920s to 1948. It is a period that was characterized of tremendous upheaval in terms of social and political life, and it was, translation was not received. حقيقة, translation received scant attention, by translation scholars. In 20 minutes, I will talk about legal pragmatics and politics, the case of a translation in the government of Palestine. In the data set for the purpose of my presentation, the source language will be English with two target languages, Arabic as first target language and Hebrew as second target language, with much emphasis on Arabic. Here is the outline of my presentation. First, I will talk about a historical glimpse about the translation and legal translation in the British mandate. Then I'll move to methodology. Namely, I will talk about significance of my paper and data of the study. Then I will go over the data analysis and discussion. There will be some concluding remarks in the final analysis. British mandate to Palestine began in the 1920s up to 1948 when Israel was founded in occupied Palestine. Throughout history, translation has always been a means of intercultural communication. Many cultures have been given a new lease of life by means of translation. An example of cultural exchange throughout history was the bulk of legal translation activities during the British mandate to Palestine, in which translation was governed by an ideology, as can be shown later in the various translation strategies employed in the examples drawn from the data of the study. Palestinians had to cater for their daily life under the British mandate. There was a good affinity between the language employed in the structure of the document under scrutiny and the social, economic, and political situations. In terms of translation, the paper shows that since Palestine was under the British mandate, in which hegemonic English pervades the legal discourse, the documents were written in English with two target languages, Arabic and Hebrew. And I will talk about the intricacies of legal translation as well as the ideology beyond the translations. As a point of departure, I would like to talk about ideology, which has several, perhaps many definitions. For the sake of my presentation, I will talk about two definitions. The first definition was offered by Thompson, ideology refers to the ways in which meaning serves to establish and sustain relations of domination. And I will relate this to the examples that I will, talk about or discuss later. The other definition was by Hatim and Mason. Ideology refers to the power emanates from the text producer's ability to impose his or her plans at the expense of the receiver's plans. Moving now to the methodology, significant of my study, it is significant. It can be considered as significant because it discusses a well-established issue in translation studies, i.e., ideology and translation. And secondly, it sheds more light on the ideology prevailing legal translation activities during the British mandates, in which translation was manipulated in a way to serve the ideology of the hegemonic power, to reinforce and to save that hegemony. Data of the study, the paper draws on these translation activities opposite to particular historical situations, i.e. the British mandate to Palestine, as can be shown in the study of 20 types of legal documents comprising tithe receipt, revenue tax receipt, registration of birth, agrarian documents, and marriage contracts, all of which were collected from a Palestinian septuagenarian and represented as sporadic periods of time. Data analysis and discussion. A typology of translation legal documents is made in which different types of legal documents, including tithe receipt, revenue tax receipt, registration of birth, agrarian documents, and marriage contracts. Then I will talk here about the marks of documents, or the marks of the documents, the characteristics of the documents. Namely, I will talk about strict syntax, legal jargon, and layouts. Starting with strict syntax. English, as you may know, displays peculiar syntactic segment, as can be clearly shown in this tithe receipt at the bottom of the slide. Personal details have been blacked out. In this receipt, an ellipsis is made. If you notice, received, if you can see, received from. So an ellipsis is made. The subject is dropped. It is a stylistic in English, anyway. Now, the corresponding translation in Arabic goes for full sentence. Istalamtu, literally, I received, and in Hebrew, niktabil mi'et, again, which means I received. So in both Hebrew and Arabic, full sentences are used. The other problem here is the syntactic and lexical related translation problems. As for the syntactic related problem, we have, in example 2, example 2 shows the coordination which is stylistic in English. It has been imitated in Arabic. So توقيع ومنصب الموظف الذي سجل الولادة. This is, the Arabic structure. It is not stylistic in Arabic. And the other issue, or in example number 3, we have a lexical related translation problem. The source language midwife, it is one word. It has been rendered by a kind of verbosity, or to use, the translation term, paraphrase, in which, one word is translated into 5 words in Arabic. اسم الشخص المخبر عن الولادة. So it is, one word in Arabic. In English, midwife, that has been translated into 5 words. The second mark of the document is layout, which is really very important in translation. As can be noted in this slide, the layout shows that the government of Palestine, that is the logo, comes first, followed by two target languages, Arabic translation first, then Hebrew translation. The layout seems to be ideologically motivated, simply because Arabic is a first target language that comes before Hebrew, and I will talk about this when it comes to order. More about, the layout is the document's physical appearance. That is to say, paragraphing, graphic choices, capitalization, indentation, etc. Now, these features are very important, in legal discourse. Farghel and Shinnaq argue that these features are sometimes governed by language-specific constraints. That is quite true as far as this tithe receipt is concerned. Now, if we take capitalization, for example, capitalization is entirely absent in Arabic and in Hebrew as well. Both are Semitic languages, and a bold type is used in the latter. And if we talk about, in example number 4 here, Government of Palestine, it is capitalized. It has been translated into Hukumat Palestine. And, the ideology beyond capitalization is that, it is to show that the translation is subservient to the source language. And if we look at example 5, the tithe receipt has been, it is in bold type, and in translation it was translated into Arabic and not bold type. And we have another issue here, that is a different graphic choices for received has been used as can be shown here. So the word received, and we have a different graphic choice. And does it have any implicature or implication? The answer seems yes. Simply because here the most important thing about this in English is to highlight money, taxes, and stuff like that. So here the layout is very important when it comes to translation. Then I'll talk about the order here. And as you may see in the Government of Palestine, in the previous example, Arabic comes, English, Arabic, then Hebrew. Now, it's very important here that, the Government of Palestine comes first, followed by two target languages, that is to say, Arabic and Hebrew. The layout is ideologically motivated. Simply because, it has to do with demographic reality in Palestine seems to be paid attention, in which the Palestine's indigenous population, whose native tongue is Arabic, formed a sweeping majority at that time. Introducing Hebrew as a second target language could be to fulfill Balfour Declaration. And the other mark is legal jargon, that is the level of formality, which features legal discourse. Hatem and Mason state that tenor relates to choices made within the interpersonal function of language and finds expression in the mood and modality in actual text. If we take, for example, tithe receipt, it is, it is a term that is, belongs to legal jargon. Legal jargon and translation. If we look at example number 7, it has connotation. Tithe receipt has many connotations, several connotations, and I just want to refer to the definition by the dictionary. It refers to 1/10 of annual produce and earnings taken as a tax for the support of the church. So the item tithe is religious oriented. The translation is formal, and functional at the same time, because it has been a new concept has been introduced into Arabic. And the ideology beyond this is to encourage Palestinians to pay the tax to support the British mandate. Then the last, I will move on. Perhaps, this is, we have another, we have addition here. That is, a translation strategy. In the previous example, Government of Palestine has been rendered into Arabic, Hukumat Palestine, that is, Government of Palestine, and literally translated into Hebrew as Hukumat Palestine, or it is translated into Memshet Balista, that is Government of Palestine, but in brackets, if you notice, an abbreviation is added that reads Eretz Yisrael, that is land of Israel. You just imagine that, we have the source language that is Government of Palestine. It was translated into Hukumat Palestine, Government of Palestine. Then in Hebrew, it was translated into Government of Palestine, but, in brackets, land of Israel is added. I will move now to conclusion. What's wrong with this? Quickly to F5. Now I'll move to conclusion. The role of the translation is significant as a tool for intercultural communication. That is to narrow the cultural gap between related and unrelated languages. And in my, study, actually, the aim of, translation was to reinforce hegemony of the British mandate to Palestine. It is pertinent for legal translators to be well versed in the language of law in terms of terminologies, syntax, and layout. And finally, it is significant for translators to be au fait with the development of legal discourse over years against a background of continuing political landscape for several decades. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. So I would like to invite you just to take a seat with us here, and I would also welcome any questions from the audience, please. Okay. Yeah, please, may I have your question?
Well, actually, thank you very much, Professor Muhammad, for this fascinating thought-provoking talk. Just I was interested in your second concluding remark when you said that the translator has to be really well versed in the legal language and in the law of both the languages that he's actually working between. I would totally agree actually with that, but then there is a question regarding how much knowledge the translator needs to know about the law of the target language. Does he need to be as knowledgeable as a lawyer, for example, in terms of the target language, or does he need just to know the legal system briefly and doesn't have to go deeper and deeper in terms of the legal conceptions, etc., etc.? You know that when we talk about legal language, we talk about terminologies, and these terminologies designate basically legal conceptions. So how far do you think a legal translator should be well versed in both legal systems?
I think we can directly answer that.
Okay. One of the things about any translator, the translator should be competent into languages and cultures. When it comes to legal translator, the translator should, or even must, be competent in the terminologies and and culture as well. Otherwise, there will be a problem simply because, when it comes to legal discourse or legal translation, it is very important for the translator to reflect, to capture, the intended meaning, and to use the term that is used in the target language. So I would use the term that, the translator should be chameleon-like. In other words, when it comes to legal discourse, he should be a lawyer. I agree with you. When it comes, for example, to literature, he should be a poet. And, without such knowledge in legal terminologies and stuff like that, the translator will, there will be, something wrong with the translation. And it is, legal translation is different from other types of translation, simply because it is binding. Any, mistake in a legal translation will have, drastic impact on the target audience.
Okay, so I just take two questions and maybe, yeah, three. There.
I have a comment. You mentioned that lawyers are more competent in legal translation than translators who are from a linguistic background. I have just heard about a recent research that was conducted at some university in Canada, and it was mentioned in one of the articles by Susan Fletcher, who's one of the common scholars in legal translation, and she mentioned that this research proved that students who were given legal training, who studied translation first, and then they were given some sort of legal training afterwards, they performed better than lawyers who were given language training. So this is like experimentally proven that a translator does not need to be a lawyer, because nowadays we are having joint discipline programs that you can receive some subjects in law studies, and you can also study linguistics and translation and language.
Okay. I agree with you that the translator, as I mentioned, should be chameleon-like, which means in all disciplines. It is not, 100% lawyer, but I mean, he or she has to know the terminologies and the culture as well. So I totally agree with you that it is perhaps difficult, to have, but at the end of the day, we need, to have, perhaps translators need to specialize, in certain area. For example, in subtitling, in legal translator, medical translator, etc. It is better for the translator to have, such a specialization.
Okay, great. I'm going to collect two questions now, and once we've collected both of them, please take responses from them. So, yeah, please first, and then Gianluca.
Thank you for this event. I was interested in your discussion of the translation of the term time, because I think this raises the issue of etymology and how, etymology, but also when we compare terms across different historical periods, are we maybe getting diverted in a way? What would be interesting is to know whether the term time in the contemporary English context, so the British Mandate in the UK, was used with religious connotations. Was it, yes, I appreciate that England is not a secular country, strictly speaking. There is no church and the state. So, how relevant would this be? Because to some extent, so many terms have religious connotations. But do we carry the burden of the connotation and the etymology when we use them? So, in a way, it's a
Thank you. And I'll just pass over to Gianluca, so then we can maybe take a second question.
This is connected to what Mariam just said. Before, I just wanted to mention that in the document you showed, I mean, I saw that you had the slide, but you didn't get to speak about it. Something that made me think of Roberta's talk last night, because the Mukhtar was kept in English as Mukhtar, as to avoid, but actually my point was precisely on the question of type, because it's interesting because I think that's one of the cases in which we need to consider the function of the actual the legal institution, right? So what is this for? Was this for the government of Palestine, or was it for religious purposes? And I'm thinking about that from the perspective of Arabic, because when you actually have Ashar, and I'm thinking of Sheikh Zadeh, he's one of the, Magma al-Anhar, one of the most, widespread, references for Hanafi fiqh. He actually has in the description of zakat, he has Bab al-Ashir, and he says al-Ashir is the one who collects taxes, and he collects taxes for religious purposes and non-religious purposes. And we just call it al-Ashir because it collects the tenth, even if it's not the tenth, right? So even in a religious text, back in the days, this idea that al-Ashir and al-Ashr could actually refer to both religious and non-religious taxes is present. So in that sense, I wonder then how more problematic is the source language rather than the target language in your heads.
Sorry, we just have one final interconnected point, and then we'll have to answer and close, if that's okay. So just behind you.
So quite connected to these two questions on the matter of type, the sort of connection between language and actual practice. So how different was the British taxation practice versus the Ottoman practice beforehand, and then what was the terminology that would have been used under the Ottoman period, and how much was translation happening in word and then practice level, or not?
Okay. As for, I agree with you, Dr. Mariam, that, sometimes, you have a word that has a religious connotation, but with the passage of time, when it is used over and over again, it drifts away from its religious connotation. Perhaps, the word tithe used under the British mandate could have no religious connotation. The dictionary meaning says, it has a religious connotation, but perhaps it is used, it drifts away from its, religious connotation. And, as for Wasl Ashar, I agree with you, right? This is Arabic, and, this is, it has a religious connotation in Arabic, Wasl Ashar. So the point here is that you have a tithe that can have no religious connotation, and it is translated to Wasl Ashar in Arabic, which has religious connotation. And it happens. And I mean, in translation, you can you can have a functional approach, and you can do, or even formal. But when it comes to legal discourse, perhaps it is recommended that a formal translation is used. But in some cases, perhaps this is one of the cases, you can go for functional one. Is it okay?
Okay. So I think we'll. I'm sure there are more chances to discuss some of the work and these questions over lunch, hopefully. But in order to get to lunch, I'd like to keep on time and manage with the time. So thank you very much. I'd like us all to thank our speaker for sharing their thoughts with us. And thank you very much. And I would like to invite our next speaker to the table, either to the floor or to our desk. So please welcome Mujib Khan from Tokai University, and he will be speaking to us today about law and modernity in non-European contexts, contemporary sensibilities, and Japanese and Islamic law. So the floor is yours.
Okay.
okay if you don't have a...
I do.
Would you have PowerPoint? Is it up?
Well, I have no idea. It's supposed to be there.
It should be there. Yeah, we have you. You are already set to this. Okay?
Okay.
And so there is a pointer here when you've got the keyboard.
This is the pointer.
That's the pointer. Yeah. And then you can also do the slides on that.
Okay. Let's see how this goes. Okay. Thank you for that introduction. As you heard, my name is Mujib Khan, and let's see how closely related this title and my talk is. I just wanted to note that today's talk will be somewhat different from what we've heard earlier, mainly because my professional expertise is, I wouldn't say transmission studies proper. Transmission studies is often precisely translation, but without expertise in translation studies. What I am always interested in is what happens after transmission. One of my earlier works kind of denotes this concept of transposition, which is this idea of bringing all these concepts together and understanding what happens in this new context. But often transmission premises concepts of reception or source text and so on, and it skews the interests of people who actually want to look at what's happening in the new context. So today I'm moving 900 years in the future to talk about the 19th century. So the first thing I want to talk about is precisely translation across cultures. And I think something we have to think about is you can translate a discipline, but you can also translate a text, and you can translate a concept and a word. And this kind of looks like we're going from a broader category to a smaller category, but sometimes words can actually take over disciplines. And obviously this can occur with what we see for everything else. So it's not necessarily a linear transition from something broader to something smaller, but depending on historical context and historical circumstances. For example, as we heard in the first talk in today's panel about rape, how are we considering these words and how is that influencing policies at certain periods in history? So if we can just keep this in mind as I go on. So the other issue is, so the first half of the talk will probably be talking a lot about these issues because I think that's really important in understanding Muhammad Abdu and Fukuzawa Yukichi, and also probably because these two intellectuals are so influential and have so much research done on them. And since this is my first talk about them, I would feel a lot more comfortable contextualizing them and having us thinking about those contexts than talking about details, which probably people here are far more experts on than I am. So first is this issue of contemporary knowledge and law, and what a lot of people don't realize is issues of modernity, especially the modern period, and what we talk about contemporary tend to become conflated when we think about the early modern period. Transitioning from the early modern period into modernity is not the same thing as modernity into the contemporary period. Of course, this includes issues of dissolution of empire, the creation of empire, and I will talk about this especially in the case of Egypt and Japan. But what this has to do with law and knowledge is you do have law, but legal traditions don't necessarily derive knowledge of law from traditions of law. Right? So for example, if we look at the Abbasi translation movement, of course we have the development of kalam, we have the development of all these other traditions. And while I will in no way say that, you know, some outside tradition influenced the creation of fiqh or kalam, but we do have to understand that the influx of this outside philosophy did not necessarily influence how people were understanding, let's say, Quranic text or the hadith corpus, but what it did do was provide far more deeper thought in regards to certain issues that might not have been available previously simply because people weren't thinking about those issues. But now that people were thinking about them, they've already been influenced in a certain way from perspectives through translation. So when they're actually discussing issues of law in their text or debating law in public, this is already there, often unwittingly. So that type of influence is important because it's not just law that we see being translated, it's also knowledge traditions that are now unintentionally on the part of the, let's say, jurisprudent coming into their works. The other issue is contemporary versus traditional. So we have to understand the difference between changing context and changing ideas. So Many of you probably have heard of Thomas Kuhn, who wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and my focus is often intellectual traditions with science and medicine. When we think about that, he has a concept of incommensurability, which means that you can have a term in two different traditions, but when the new tradition begins, and this is his argument for modern science, the term means something that it cannot mean in the earlier tradition. And this is how you see a revolution. So what that means is, if a context changes, a term might have changed. It doesn't necessarily mean the idea changed. It just means that the context has changed, so the idea has changed because of the context. Not necessarily because the person intentionally wanted to change the idea. It's just that in their application of that idea to a new context, they've, again, unintentionally changed the idea. So these are things we also want to keep in mind, because this comes into the issue of intentionality, which of course is related to what I mentioned just before this. And then the other issue is legal flexibility. And although I won't touch on law proper, as most of the discussions today have done, there is an issue of intrinsic versus explicit. So what that means is intrinsic is something that's inborn to a system, right? And so this means that a system can handle something. And if you read, for example, some recent work by Muhammad Fadl about a few years ago, where it talks about how you're kind of working with reforming a tradition from within, and then you can look at the Maliki school, which a lot of people talk about in its flexibility because it allows certain things. And obviously in most fiqh schools, they talk about maslaha, which in the contemporary tradition now comes to mean a greater good. These are things that you're talking about changing something. Explicit is more when you're talking about saying what you're doing, which is different from extrinsic, which means you're taking ideas from the outside. And this kind of brings us back to the first issue, which is their ideas coming from the outside and influencing us. So now with this in mind, let me just briefly talk about something I probably should not be talking about, women and eugenics. So one is the issue of conceptualizing women. So if we look at, for example, the early modern period, at the medieval period and so on, what some people make the mistake of doing is they look at women as a separate category from men in all contexts. So in certain contexts, women are separate. For example, if you look at medicine, you have childbirth, obstetrics, gynecology, and so on. But when you're issuing other statements regarding people, and they're using the term man or person, are they actually distinguishing between men and women? And this is an issue because often we don't know, because this is we have to really understand the culture there. You can not do this by simply looking at that text. And this is what Professor Muhammad was saying earlier as well. You need to understand context. So when you're translating, you can't just translate a word. You have to really understand that discipline. But when it comes to the contexts that aren't contemporary, now it's not only understanding a discipline, it's also understanding a whole culture and what is considered normal in that culture. And again, and then women as individuals, and I'll briefly talk about that towards the end. Okay, so now I wanted to talk about the historical and legal context. In terms of the Arab Islamic world, I think this is more obvious for everyone. When we have the Ottoman Tanzimat reforms, whereas in Japan you have something called the Meiji Restoration 1868. So what that is actually a group of people who were fighting against European, well, I shouldn't say European, it was actually the Americans who came in and were asking to have trades. They were fighting against their own, what they believed to be subjugation towards foreign powers. And yet when they actually succeeded, which means they removed the people who were in power, which everyone knows as the shogun and his people, they accepted foreign help because they believed in watching what was going on that there was a difference. Because their society had not been colonized, they were only now coming to see how different society was after 300 years of peace in Japan. So they accepted that help and decided to change. And this is actually somewhat similar to what you're seeing with the Tanzimat reforms. But one of the issues here is that what's going on here, not only do you have Egypt as kind of area proper, it's also part of the Ottoman state. And it's also under the influence of the French than British. So what's happening with these reforms is it's not actually changes that are going on to benefit society. And many of these reforms are actually what lead to the British gaining power, because they modernize, but not necessarily in a way that's helpful for them, which brings people like especially Afghani and other people, Livingston, who I believe John Livingston or Bill Livingston, who just put out a book on modern science as well as science, pre-modern science in the Islamic world and modern science, he details how you see people who are not very unhappy with these Tanzimat reforms precisely because they're working against Egyptian culture and Egyptian society, and they're not helping in the way that they should have been helping, and they're kind of moving society backwards. I think you can see this discussion as well as in Sidgwick's great biography of Muhammad Abdu, where you see he talks about how Afghani is against these, Jamaluddin Afghani is against these, precisely against these issues because they are changing things in society, but in the wrong way. They're not modernizing Egypt, they're Europeanizing it. Whereas now when you're looking at negotiating modernity through, in Japan, what they're actually doing is they do look at how do you change society. And this kind of brings us to the issue of constitutionalism. And what that means is you have two constitutions on both sides in Egypt and in Japan between about between 1880 and 1945. So what you see in Egypt in that early constitution and what you also see in Japan's 1887 constitution is this isn't a contemporary or modern constitution. What that means is, as an American, growing up, I always understood a constitution to mean a Bill of Rights for individuals. But pre-modern constitutions are in fact not that. They're rights for nobles. They're, in a sense, it's something that limits the power of the main leader so that nobles have some type of control and they can kind of keep the leader in check, but not that the average person has certain rights. And why this is important is because in the context of individuals, you can't really talk about women if you're not talking about people in general. What we actually see, though, in the next constitution of 1923 as well as 1930, in Articles 13 and 14 for Egypt, they talk about freedom of religion and thought. In Article 19, what's interesting is that you see issues in terms of education for young girls. It says boys and girls in terms of their primary education. On the other hand, in Japan, in the 1946 treaty, which is after they lose World War II, in Article 14, they include gender. So whereas in Egypt's 1923 and also subsequent 1930 constitution, they talk about no discrimination in terms of religious belief and thought, they don't include women, but they do include it in the context of education, which is actually significant, as I'll talk about when we get to specifically what I claim to have said my topic was. And in terms of Japan, you do see women here. And this is significant because women are now identified as a group in society that are not allowed to face discrimination. Of course they do, but this is how law works. There's something on the books, and that's not necessarily what happens. So, okay, let me go on to the people who are the big stars of today's talk. They do only get one slide, but I hope this has kind of contextualized who they were. So Muhammad Abdu and Fukuzawa Yukichi. These are names, if you've done anything in East Asia, you know who Fukuzawa Yukichi is. He's one of these major figures in modernizing Japan. So he comes of age in a Japan that has now had a revolution. They've had the Meiji Restoration, and now they're creating empire. Whereas what's happening to Muhammad Abdu? He's coming of age in a society where the Tanzimat reforms have not gone well. He meets Jamaluddin Afghani, and there are many stories about Jamaluddin Afghani and how he's always very close to power wherever he goes, and he learns certain things from him. But what both of these men see is society. They see the society around them, and they constantly try and react to that society. And one of the main reasons for that is because both of them were sent as intellectuals of their societies abroad, to Europe and the United States and so on. And why that's important is because they weren't just seeing their own society, they were able to see society beyond what was considered standard around them. And not in a negative way, more in a educational way. So they were able to understand the differences between their societies at a time when their own societies were trying to change. And this becomes important because in Japan, what we see, in Japan, what we see with Fukuzawa Yukichi is he writes in a newspaper called Jiji Shimpo, which is one of these things he creates, and he constantly writes about different issues, and one of the issues he writes about is women. So He writes, for example, The Theory of Japanese Women, Nihon Fujinron. And he writes 2 different articles. The first one is actually written in more polite Japanese. The second one is written in more colloquial Japanese. And in these things, he addresses issues about women, how to treat women, about their modernization, about allowing them to do certain things. And why that's important is because people argue he's either promoting women, and others argue he's not promoting them because he's identifying them as important in a family structure and learning important female household roles, what we might call traditional gender roles. But in terms of the society he was in, he saw that Japanese women weren't able to do much, and he was trying to understand why, and he realized that Japanese women weren't educated. So although he advocates for education of Japanese women, his advocation is from a contemporary sense, not necessarily as liberal as we might like. In the same context, Muhammad Abdu, especially in his fatwa that we see, he talks about giving the right of divorce to women. He writes in Al-Manar and Al-Urwa al-Wuthqa. He writes in many newspapers, but it's essentially his fatwas. And you see him talking about having women being treated equally, but again, it's not in the contemporary sense. In the 19th century, this would be, I believe this would be considered liberal, especially in places like Egypt, where on paper you might say something, but in society you didn't see that. And what you now start to see happen is that in both cases, what they're doing is they're speaking against normative standards that you see in law. In the case of Fukuzawa Yukichi, his work is not necessarily the only work that exists at this time, but it does lead to eugenic laws about kind of society and how to understand greater society. And Japan starts to see itself on the world stage, especially with empire, in terms of what it means to be Japanese, how to create a proper Japanese empire, and women are come to be seen as a very important part of this. And that deals with abortion, that deals with who you can marry. Whereas in terms of Muhammad Abdu, he's actually passing these laws, especially when he becomes Grand Mufti of Egypt. You see how he has a lot of difficulties in terms of dealing with the people at Azhar, as well as some of the other statespeople at the time. Now, just to finish everything up, because I'm already over time, is that both of them wanted universities. Fukuzawa Yukichi actually did create a university for people that contrasted what you see with missionary universities. Many of the universities today in Tokyo are missionary-based universities, whereas Fukuzawa Yukichi created his own. Muhammad Abdu always had a desire for that because he wanted to create legal jurists who were able to operate in a proper manner. And he was operating, of course, when you had the Sharia courts, and then you had these British-created courts, and he saw that most people weren't prepared. And unfortunately, in his time, what we now call Cairo University was only created by one of his students or friends after his death, but he argued in the same way for certain women's rights. And both of these were very much based not just on legal issues, but on how they understood these legal issues and the place of women in society. And it kind of deals with their different approaches to European modernities and how they applied that modernity to their societies. Sorry, that's a 30-second talk there. But essentially, the point of constitutionalism was if you don't include women in society, you can't include them in the constitution because they're not really visible. So what these two people were doing is, one wasn't actually a lawyer, but his ideas affected society, and you had a lot of women's rights movements in the early 1910s and 20s in Japan, especially the 1920s, that then led to the 1930s proposal for eugenics law. So what you see is they're operating in a world that's constantly changing. One is where society, not society, but an empire is breaking down, and another is where an empire is being created. But what you see is both of them are dealing with European modernities and trying to apply them in a way that's not just Egyptian or Japanese, but that's also very practical and sometimes seen as negative by others who are more interested and conforming to traditional ideas and laws rather than seeing how those laws can benefit that society. Thank you.
You are welcome to stand or to take a seat, but I would like to invite the audience to ask any questions that they may have for you with regards to your talk. So I will just collect maybe a couple of things. I'll start off with you first, actually, and you can respond directly, and then I'll come to the front row as well. Okay.
Thanks for the talk. The points that you mentioned about the confluence of traditions across two legal jurisdictions are very interesting. I never knew about the second chapter. That's all new to me. I knew about the constitutional reforms in Japan, not about where it came from. But recently, there's also been a lot of cases in Japan on the rights of what they call illegitimate something that we've also seen in Arab jurisdictions a lot about the rights of the to acquire nationality, inheritance, etc. Do you think there's still that confluence and that influence going on from such societies? Because they both tended to be very traditional societies, one more religious-based and one more tradition-based. But the modern reforms that we're seeing now from the judiciary in Japan on some of these issues look remarkably like what we've already seen in Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt. That's the question.
Okay, so one of the things I want to say is we should be very careful when we say one is religious and one is tradition-based, right? Because again, we just had a question about, there are these concepts that didn't exist in a certain society, but how we understand religion is often skewed by our own understanding of how we contextualize it within a certain area. So a lot of people will actually claim Japan was Confucian-based and then call Confucianism a religion, but actually Japan was a mix of Shintoism and Buddhism until Japan decided to become an empire and adopt a national religion, but because Christianity wasn't their own and Buddhism was technically Chinese, they created state Shinto. So in that sense, they are similar. They're actually quite similar there. So when Muhammad Abdu is doing in terms of kind of taking pragmatic approaches to things, that's actually what the Japanese were literally doing at that point. And in terms of the contemporary situation, Japanese law is now kind of a mix of, you can say, British, German, and some other European traditions, simply because their early constitution was very much German-based and some other European influence, whereas after the Americans came, they have that strong influence post-1945. In terms of the current reforms, they're very much code-based. So it's not that they have an influence from the outside. They're very much looking at what they already have in the legal books. And they always go after legal precedent, except the interesting thing about Japanese law in the contemporary context is that instead of repealing a law and saying it's wrong, for example, in terms of what you might see in the United States, they'll reinterpret it while saying this is the actual interpretation. And this is interesting because you see this in many pre-modern traditions. And just like Rashid Rida interprets Muhammad Abdu and Plato interprets Socrates, this is what they're doing with their own previous legal precedents, and they're not stepping on their own feet by doing that. They're simply saying, oh, this is what they meant. Yeah.
We've got a question in the front row, please. Yeah.
Okay. Well, actually, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. You did actually talk about the importance of including women in the Japanese constitution. I was actually wondering if this constitution is to be translated into Arabic. Now, you know that there is a heated debate regarding, the gender terms or gender-based terms and how they are used actually in Arabic. And most of the constitutions that, at least I've come across, they either use the masculine-based terms or the neutral based terms such as fard, shakhs, etc., etc. But unfortunately, I haven't come across any, Arabic constitution which actually uses gender or actually feminine-based terms. So, what's your opinion? How about if the Japanese constitution, the Japanese which has masculine, terms, how about if it is actually to be translated into Arabic? What would the translator do in this case? Thank you.
Thank you for actually the very important question in terms of language. We're speaking English, and we're talking about one language that's VSO and another language that's SOV, and English is SVO, so all three languages are actually quite grammatically different. One of the issues is in most character-based languages of East Asia, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese, even though they're not necessarily part of the same family tree, there is no gender. Right? So you don't have gender-based words like you do in Arabic or German. Whereas for English speakers, we're not often aware of that, but this does become an issue with words like God and so on. So when they're saying gender, they actually use the explicit word of gender. So this is more an issue of talking about explicit rights. So it's not saying that there's no intrinsic understanding or implicit understanding within the Constitution that says that women have these rights, but the notion that they explicitly include sex or gender as something that you can't discriminate against. So that could, of course, be because they feel that there is no discrimination, or it could be because it hasn't come to a point where it's become an issue. And that obviously deals with historical understandings and context. In Japan's case, it was an issue, and women did, once they became educated, there was a lot more, you can say, tour de force in terms of trying to get their own rights. And that's probably one of the underpinnings in the use of that explicit word.
But how they are represented in the Japanese constitution? I mean, the women. You said.
Oh, so right. So when I meant representation, I apologize if I was saying that women are in there, as in here are women. It just notes that people have certain rights, and you can't have your rights discriminated against based on religious affiliation or other issues, for example, race and so on. And in Japan's constitution, it includes gender here as one of those anti-discriminatory issues.
Thank you.
Thank you. So do we have any more questions that we can collect at the moment? Okay. Right. So, yes.
A moment of
Sorry.
promotion. A moment of promotion since gender and the use of Arabic for gender.
Thank you,
We're
Jamil.
going to have...
I thought you were asking me your photo or something. No. But yes, we are, yeah, please, yeah. Good. So we are on the 13th of December. Thank you. And please have a seat. So on the 13th of December, we are having an Arabic for Gender workshop that is being organized by the governance program. Arabic for Gender, practical views on gendered language in human rights, education and policy context. So it ties very much in with what we've had just discussed earlier today. And we'll have keynote speakers, Hilary Footit from Reading and Isla Jad from Birzeit. So you'll find these pitted around and dotted around the room. So please take one and please do join us. But let's also not forget to give a big round of applause to Mujib Khan. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your really, really interesting and insightful work.